Crash Bandicoot is back! Again. And this time he's available just about everywhere. That's right, Vicarious Visions' remastered trilogy is now available on Nintendo Switch, the Xbox One, and PC, joining last year's PlayStation 4 release. It's fair to say that I was pretty impressed with this package last time around. The N.Sane Trilogy is still a great example of how to remaster a PlayStation-era game. While the visuals are dramatically more detailed than the original games as you'd expect, the style and atmosphere of Naughty Dog's PS1 games has been completely retained. This is not an easy thing to accomplish, but Vicarious Visions has done an excellent job. With this new release then, this is the first time that these original 3 games have appeared on another platform. The Crash series has been multi-platform since the PS2 era, of course, but these PS1 originals remained exclusive to PlayStation for decades. So now that he's made the jump, how does it stack up? Well, on the surface, this seems like a pretty straightforward port. It looks very similar across each machine at a glance, but if you dig a little deeper, there's a lot more going on here than you might have first anticipated. There's a whole host of changes on Nintendo Switch, for instance, in addition to one glaring flaw, while the PC version provides some interesting insight into certain choices made during development. And how about that Xbox version? Well, to find out, we're going to discuss each version of the game while trying to get a better idea of how they all stack up. In terms of visual makeup, I think it's safe to say that most people watching this video are probably interested in the Nintendo Switch version. This is usually where we see the most compromises after all, and Crash is no exception. For starters, the resolution on Switch is lower than the other versions of the game, coming in at 720p for docked mode and 480p while gaming in portable mode. Not really a surprise, mind you, but there it is. Of course, it's worth keeping in mind that when I say 480p, I'm talking about 853 by 480 rather than an anamorphic 480p, as is often the case with DVD movies and classic 480p capable consoles. It looks reasonably clear, I suppose, but it also seems as if they're simply using a basic FXAA here, whereas a nice temporal AA solution could have really cleaned things up. In comparison, the other consoles fare a lot better in terms of pixel count. Both the base PlayStation 4 and the base Xbox One managed to deliver a full 1080p output. I was actually kind of surprised to see the Xbox One serve up the game in full HD, but here it is, and it looks great. The Pro version then is still 1440p, just as it was last year, while the Xbox One X version offers full native 4K, making it the cleanest console version of the game by far. Of course, the PS4 situation isn't identical to last year. A new patch was just released, but we'll get to those details in a moment. To round out the resolution talk though, the PC version of course allows for a multitude of resolution choices, but it only supports a 16:9 aspect ratio. With the narrow design of the game, this isn't a real surprise, I suppose. It's entirely possible, and likely in fact, that the area outside of the 16:9 window just isn't complete, since I'd imagine ultra-wide was not originally part of the development discussions. If you're playing on Xbox One, PS4, or even the PC then, Crash looks basically identical. I did notice one oddity though. Motion blur has been toned down in the current version of the game. If we look back here at the original PS4 Pro footage compared against version 1.06, which is the latest patch, it looks like the shutter speed has been modified and blur is now less pronounced as a result. This applies to every version of the game in fact, well, except for the Switch port where motion blur is actually more evident. That's not the only difference however, the Switch version of Crash features a lot of other changes as well. In that sense, Vicarious Visions has taken a different approach than Panic Button's Wolfenstein 2 port. Rather than sacrificing resolution in favor of maintaining visual parity, the team has opted instead to pare back several visual features instead. The thing is, while Wolf 2 aims for realism, where these effects are crucial to its overall look, the animated nature of Crash means that the lack of these features kinda has less of an impact overall on visual quality. So let's start with the most obvious visual difference then, the lack of fur shading. On other platforms, Crash's model uses this technique to give the impression of fur. In comparison on Switch, the effect is simply absent, replaced instead with textures. This applies to other creatures and characters throughout the game as well, not just Crash. So how does it actually look then? Well, I feel like Crash himself still looks pretty good without his fur, and some may even argue that it feels closer to a classic game as a result. But the rest of the characters, well, the results aren't great. These lions, for instance, now look as if they're made of chocolate or mud. Or how about this little guy? And really, that's just the beginning. The remake of Crash also makes use of self-shadowing parallax occlusion maps to add extra depth to the world. These carved indents in this rock, for instance, are simply a texture trick, but it looks fantastic. On Switch, this has been eliminated entirely, and such textures are reduced to a flat surface instead. I understand the need to cut it, but this one kinda hits hard as this technique is used in nearly every stage, and its absence is especially noticeable. Look at the floor in this cutscene. Or how about the tiles along the top of the wall, or even the bricks for that matter? It's all missing on Switch. That being said, while the lack of palm is certainly noticeable, the cartoony nature of the art direction also means that the game still manages to look nice without these textures. It loses some depth, sure, but it's hardly ugly as a result. But it's not just the parallax occlusion maps that have gone missing, however. In other stages, world geometry has been modified on Switch. It's clear as day in this section where the door positions and terrain complexity have all been modified on Switch. Little changes like this are evident throughout the experience. So thus far then, we have a reduction in texture quality, an absence of parallax occlusion maps, simplified world geometry, and a lack of ambient occlusion, or at least greatly reduced AO. But there's more. In this stage, Crash runs through an oily substance which ripples based on character interaction, while reflecting and distorting the surrounding environment. What's interesting here is that even the original PlayStation 1 game attempts to simulate reflections by drawing models both above and below the surface plane. It's a key part of the art direction for this stage. On Switch, however, the effect is completely missing, which leaves certain stages like this feeling somewhat incomplete and empty. Thankfully, reflections like this only appear in certain stages. Water, for instance, typically does not exhibit reflections, thus the results appear on par with other versions of the game. What's important here is that the ripple shader is still intact, which means Crash and enemies can break the surface of these pools of liquid, creating lovely ripples while doing so. Next on our list is foliage reduction, which I guess kind of fits in with the aforementioned geometry changes. In this stage, for instance, grass and plants are paired back on the Switch, both in the near and far field region of the screen. This is a rather smart cut, however, as the difference only becomes noticeable when directly comparing against other versions of the game. On its own, it still manages to look convincingly full. It's a perfect example of smart optimization. Shadow map resolution is, expectedly, lower overall as well, but it's what isn't rendered that is more noticeable here. Only completely opaque objects seem to cast shadows on the Switch, and it kind of varies from stage to stage. Things like leaves from the surrounding trees in this scene, for instance, are spotty in comparison, leaving us with areas devoid of shadow. Based on our experience with the PC version, which we'll be touching on shortly, shadow quality has the most significant impact on overall performance, so it makes sense to reduce this setting. But reducing the number of objects which can cast shadows in a scene does have a significant impact on the overall presentation. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that certain types of leaves do actually cast shadows, so you will occasionally see shadow maps like this, but by and large, leaves and grass do not cast shadows. That's a lot of changes, right? So let's quickly recap then. So in docked mode, Switch is 720p, it's 480p in handheld, it's missing reflections, fur shading, parallax occlusion maps, all while exhibiting reductions in texture quality, geometry complexity, and ambient occlusion. With all those changes, you'd kind of expect the Switch version to look rather poor, but as you've no doubt seen, the results are still pretty good. It's a step down from other versions, but it still kind of holds up. It's a nice looking game. But what about those other versions then? Well, for all intents and purposes, the Xbox and PlayStation 4 versions look basically identical, outside of resolution variants, of course. There are some subtle shading and shadow differences evident in certain areas, but overall it's really minor stuff and they basically look the same. What's neat is that both versions now support HDR. As of version 1.06 on PS4 and out of the gate on Xbox, you can play the game in HDR. The problem here though is that the implementation is kind of poor. The brightness variance appears relatively low and there are no additional adjustments to be made here. It just feels as if the game is simply tone mapped to run in HDR without really taking advantage of it. Thus the image can actually appear less vibrant in HDR than when running in SDR. A disappointing thing for sure. Another key improvement in this version is loading. Back when I covered the original version on PlayStation 4, loading times were at the top of my complaint list. It takes forever to go between stages in this version of the game, and it absolutely ruins the flow. Now on Xbox One and PS4 with the latest patch installed, loading times are greatly reduced. Vicarious Visions has implemented predictive loading, which basically tries to load data based on where you might go next, while also holding certain common assets in memory at all times. Xbox One X takes the lead here for sure, with loading times so fast that the game almost doesn't need a loading screen at all. PS4 Pro is a little slower than Xbox One X, but it still offers a significant improvement over the release version of the game, often saving upwards of 10 seconds or more. It's the same deal on Switch, which is comparable to the PS4 Pro version or even a little faster. In all cases, it's a lot faster than the original 2017 release, and it helps make for a better overall experience. But there's another curious thing I wanted to discuss, the frame rate. When Crash launched last year, we lamented the fact that the game was capped at 30 frames per second. It was unclear why this was selected, but thanks to the new PC version of the game, we now have more information regarding its performance. Now, this is all speculation, of course, but I feel that Crash should have been 60 frames per second, at least on the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, and here's why. To test our theory, we loaded up the PC version of the game on a quad-core Athlon X4 5370 paired with a GTX 960 graphics card. It just so happens that this particular Athlon CPU uses the now infamous Jaguar microarchitecture. Yep, just like the consoles, it's a Jag. The difference here is that this variant is only a quad core, while the consoles have access to more cores for games. This Cinebench test shows the system running with a 100 MHz overclock, bringing it up to 2.3 GHz, a match for the Xbox One X clock speed. So how does it fare? Well, check it out. This is Crash running at 1080p, 60 frames per second on a machine that is less powerful than Xbox One X. This GTX 960 is certainly less capable than the GPU included in the X, yet this combo is able to power through the game smoothly. This is with all settings maxed out, by the way, except for shadows, which were reduced from ultra to high. So this is a promising start, but then we get to Crash 3. This game exhibits minor drops, but hardware utilization isn't quite right, leading us to believe that there's a bug or problem going on here. Basically, CPU utilization kind of sticks around 60%. These drops occur whether or not you're using a GTX 960 or a GTX 970, which is a lot more powerful, and it seems like something that could have been corrected if they were targeting a fixed console platform at 60 frames per second. The point is, Crash at 60 frames per second seems completely feasible on these consoles, and it's kind of puzzling to us why Vicarious opted to cap at 30 frames per second instead. All evidence suggests that it could work. Of course, keep in mind that this is speculation on our part. We have the numbers here from the PC, but we really can't say one way or another. That said, Xbox One X features a much stronger GPU. And access to 2.5 more CPU cores for games out of 8 total. It's really a shame too, as the game plays significantly better at 60 frames per second. The controls are simply more responsive overall, and the game looks a lot nicer when moving at this clip. Thankfully though, even at 30 frames per second, Crash still feels remarkably responsive on the Xbox and PlayStation 4. But then there's the Switch again. Remember the issue I mentioned earlier in the video? Well, here it is. The Switch version of Crash seems to exhibit additional input latency compared to other versions of the game. Now, when it comes to testing input latency, I don't really have a strong scientific method here. We might need to wait for Nigel Woodall to look at it, but from my limited testing using a 240 frames per second filmed sequence, Switch adds roughly 2 frames or so of input latency, or 33 milliseconds, on top of the other versions. So how does this manifest? Well, you might notice it in that the Switch version feels ever so slightly heavier than the others. It was immediately clear to me when flipping between the two, that's for sure. It's not bad, but it does feel slightly off. It's also possible that it could be some sort of dead zone issue with the controller. The Joy-Con controls, for instance, feel even worse. Still, whatever the cause, I found that the game just felt less responsive on Switch overall, even when playing on the built-in screen. Just something to think about. Then we come to frame rate. We've already established last year that the PS4 and PS4 Pro versions of Crash run at 30 frames per second locked. Based on my testing on version 1.06, that remains the case here. Now it's true, it might be possible to drop a frame here or there in very select circumstances, but in my testing, it's very uncommon. Xbox One X offers a flawless 30 FPS experience in comparison, as it should. Considering how much headroom they must have here, any dips would be genuinely surprising. It's a very fluid, stable 30 frames per second, though yeah, we kinda wish it was more. The base Xbox One then does a nice job as well. I did note a couple dropped frames here and there when testing on this Xbox One S, but for the most part, performance was stable and it does play very well. It's nearly the equal of the base PlayStation 4 version in fact. Nintendo's Switch, however, is perhaps the least impressive of the bunch in terms of performance. Despite dropping a ton of effects and lowering the resolution, there are still minor hiccups in performance during gameplay. There's basically two problems to discuss here: frame rate drops and frame time inconsistencies. These two issues tend to go together, where you'll encounter a run of dropped frames like this, with a few 16.7 millisecond updates occurring along the way. Those 16 millisecond spikes can occur out of the blue as well. So why does this matter? Well, while it's true that these dips are not significant, the slight inconsistency does impact overall fluidity of the experience. This is a platforming game after all, and those little hitches can prove annoying when they crop up. Thankfully, they don't crop up that often, and I'd say the majority of the experience is a stable 30 frames per second, just like this. So perhaps it really isn't a huge problem after all, but it is something to consider. Which is kinda how I feel about the Switch version as a whole. There are a lot of compromises being made here, and they all kind of add up. The resolution is sliced down to 720p or lower in portable mode. A lot of visual details and effects have been removed. There's a tiny bit of additional input latency present and or dead zone issues, and it has the slowest frame rate of the bunch on average. Still, it's kind of a miracle that this port happened at all. From what I understand, it sounds like a single engineer took the time to port the first levels of the game over to Switch in order to convince management to push through and develop the entire game for the platform. Sure, it has its limitations, but clearly the effort was worth it, and now we have Crash on the Switch. It's not the best version, but it's still pretty good. Next up is the Xbox One version, on an Xbox One S or a base system. Here, performance is mostly a locked 30 FPS, but it can exhibit occasional minor dips. It's very minor though, I should stress, and it's basically on par with the PS4 version overall. Both versions are excellent if you're looking for a smooth 1080p 30 experience. Following this, we have the PS4 Pro version, which comes in at 1440p with rock solid performance, most of the time at least. This was previously the best option, but it's now been dethroned by Xbox One X, which is the best console version with native 4K support and a perfectly stable frame rate. Plus, it has the fastest loading times. The actual best version, though, is on PC, where even a super low spec PC can deliver a smooth 60 frames per second experience. This makes a greater difference than anything else here, and it's a shame that the enhanced consoles are missing out on this option. Of course, for owners of high refresh rate monitors, you're not going to be able to go over 60 FPS. It seems to be limited to either 30 or 60, which is definitely something to keep in mind in addition to the lack of ultra-wide support. But if you can deal with that in the relatively limited options menu, it's a pretty good port overall. Beyond that, one extra bonus worth mentioning here are the new bonus stages. This new release of the game includes stages like this. These are basically extra challenging stages designed to put your skills to the test, and it's a nice little addition to the game. You can even access this one right from the beginning. Ultimately, this remastered trilogy is extremely well crafted overall, and Vicarious Visions has done a nice job working on every version of the game. From what I understand, Toys for Bob also contributed to its development, so good job all around. Revisiting the game once again this year has allowed me to appreciate just how much work has gone into this version. It really does offer a tremendous improvement in visuals over the PS1 originals, as you would expect, with some nice tweaks to the core gameplay as well. It is a perfect lesson in how to translate 32-bit style platforming into the modern era, which is why I'm so curious to see how the remastered version of Spyro the Dragon turns out later this year. The included teaser trailer certainly looks promising. But that's all for now. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the bell to enable notifications of new content, and even follow us over on Twitter. But until next time, this is John signing off.